Time. It's on your side. It's yours to kill. It keeps ticking away. Where do we bide our time? On appliances, buildings, gadgets, and of course, around our wrist. Plop down a sawbuck and you have all the time in the world. But what if you want more than just a timepiece?
Watches are functional, four-dimensional objects of art.
It's a piece of art because of the quality, the history, and the way it is made.
And that mix of practicality and craftsmanship makes a vintage watch something to collect.
Watches provide every collector something that can express their own unique passion and connoisseurship.
Watches are also finely tuned pieces of machinery. A lot goes into making sure they run smoothly, and that's part of the allure for collectors.
I couldn't believe my eyes. The workmanship, the mechanism, it just comes to life in your hands. And it's a feeling of, wow, I got it.
So how do you find that vintage mechanical wonder? We went to the experts, collectors, and those in the know for the inside scoop here on Collective Intelligence, the top 20 tips you need to know about collecting vintage wristwatches. Horology, the science of time, has been studied for centuries. Pocket watches were invented in the late 17th century. Soon after, the first wristwatch came along for fashion-forward women.
You never would have seen a man wearing a wristwatch. It was actually a lady's adornment.
During World War I, men began to see the need to have time on hand.
Basically, coming with the war, it became a desirability and a necessity to have something that was portable and easily readable.
By 1930, the wristwatch was in annual production numbers, taking over and eclipsing the production of pocket watches.
And now there are millions of watches to choose from. Where does the collector begin? At Tip 20, of course. Join the NAWCC.
If you are a collector, you are enthusiastic, you want to learn more, you want to meet other collectors, I would say the largest organization here is the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors.
With 175 chapters worldwide and its own museum, the NAWCC is one of the largest, most comprehensive collections of watches and clocks in North America.
We use the NAWCC as a working tool, as obviously some of our merchandise can be consigned or can be found at these trade shows. But for private clients, if they can, I think it's a good ground to start to be able to be around a lot of watches, around a lot of dealers, and learn more about the trade and watches.
The association will give you the whole package, and that's a great thing because that's what you want for your watch.
See that you can acquire anything that originally came with the watch when the watch was made and left the factory.
And that's tip 19. Find the whole package.
Normally these watches come in a presentation box, they come with a certificate, and they come with an instruction manual, and all these little things later will be important to collectors.
Very recently we just received a vintage Rolex chronograph from a client that still had the original box, the original certificate, as well as the instructions. These will probably add to the value of the watch and bring about 30% better at auction than if it didn't have anything at all.
The more you have, the more the watch is worth, so keep it all together. Some collectors only collect extremely exact timepieces called chronometers. These watches are so precise, they come with a certificate of authenticity.
Anytime any paperwork that documents the watch as being as original and as precise as possible is always going to, help to increase the collectability and the value.
And who's in charge of doling out these certificates? That would be the Contrôle Officieux Suisse de Chronométrie, an official institute in Geneva.
Watchmaking companies can submit watch movements there, and the movements will be tested there, and if the watches are qualifying, they get a chronometer certificate or rating certificate, and only then a watch can be considered a chronometer.
But if your certification is missing, that's actually okay. Tip number 18 is, no paper, no problem. The watch still has value because it's been certified by the Swiss, and there may be other clues.
A chronometer watch has the word chronometer imprinted on the dial or on the movement. And even with the original certificate gone, it gives us an indication that the watch was built and regulated, and for that reason it will still hold a little bit more value.
So, if you're missing the paper but have the imprint, you're still okay.
Watch collectors live and breathe by their loop.
There are some tools that are optional, but everyone agrees that you need a loop.
A loop is probably the most important tool to start with. It allows you to have the most up-close view of the movement, the case, and the dial. And it's going to give you the best inspector's tool that you can start with.
Any nicks, any scratches, any types of refinishing, they all affect value. So with a loop, you have to inspect every single millimeter of that dial to make sure it's in the condition as described by the dealer. And the only way to determine these condition issues is with your loop.
Just make sure you know how to use it.
We often see new collectors entering the market not knowing how to use it, and very often the first reflex that they have is to use it and use it the wrong way around. It should be used as such.
So get in the loop and be prepared. Okay, so you find a watch you like. Do you squirrel it away or put it on display?
If you've been looking for a watch for a long time and have just found it, I think the first thing to do is just enjoy it and wear it on your wrist.
Wear it not just to enjoy it, but to make sure that it runs at its best.
If you do own a vintage watch, it's better to wear it as often as possible. It keeps the movement better lubricated, therefore preventing the oil from gripping up and your movement getting stuck.
So show off your watch and consider tip 16. Wear it.
Wear the watch or wind it at regular times during this initial period. For example, if it's a watch that has to be wound, wind it every evening before you go to sleep, or wind it in the morning when you get up.
Your watch needs a regular winding schedule in order for it to run smoothly. There are mechanical watches that you wind, and then there are automatic watches. You have to wear them, or else.
Very often, people have bought an automatic watch not knowing that it's automatic, and then after not wearing it for a few days, the watch stops. So they think that the watch is actually broken. People come back and say, but I don't understand, the watch doesn't work anymore. And you have to say, listen, you have to wear it every day for it to wind and for it to work.
It's your body's movements that wind the watch. But of course, you can't wear it all the time. So follow tip 15 and get a winder.
An automatic watch is, in other words, a self-winding watch. And in order that the watch can wind itself, you have to wear it or you have to put it on a mechanical winder. That's a machine that will rotate the watch during the day, that it provides energy so that it can continue to run.
The rotor inside your watch keeps it running. It can rotate in two directions, clockwise or counterclockwise.
But the winder should be set to the right direction. It should rotate in order to wind that particular watch. Otherwise, you will have the watch for a whole day on the winder and it will stop running because, in fact, it has not been wound.
So don't get all wound up. Get a winder. There are many things inside the watch that can determine quality. So should you pry it open? We say no.
If you're not a watchmaker, don't open the back of a watch.
Unless you are a professional watchmaker, keep it shut. That's tip number 14.
There's a lot of stuff in there that's very delicate and intricate, and any dust, any moisture, or any even touch of the surfaces, your fingerprints have oils, and those oils can damage the steels.
It's even worse when you have a waterproof watch. Improper opening can break the seal.
What happens is they try to open the watch and then reclose it themselves, and they close it badly, and then on the first opportunity that they get into a pool or into the shower, the moisture gets in and then they get extremely rusty movements.
And what else can happen?
I was young. My dad got a good watch and I decided to open up the back of the watch. And when I opened up the back of the watch, I was amazed, of course, with the wonderful movement and the mechanisms, and just fascinated. And I knew if somebody caught me with the watch open, I'd get in a lot of trouble. So I heard footsteps, and immediately I took a pillow to try to hide the watch. Fortunately for me, he never wore the watch and he was never able to discover that it wasn't keeping any time.
So, unless you are a professional watchmaker, keep them closed.
For a watch to be correct, the hands and the dial and the movement and the case must all be of the same era.
Watches can get recased over and over again through the years. Different parts from different places and times can end up together in the same watch.
Somebody took a nice condition case of a later watch and put the rare things like the rare dial and the rare bezel and the rare hands onto this newer watch to try to get more money. And that watch is called a Frankenwatch.
So heed lucky tip 13 and beware the Frankenwatch.
How do you determine what era the watch is from? You determine that from the serial number.
Ah, the serial numbers. Watches have records and you can track those back to the manufacturers.
In 90% of the cases, the watches should have some sort of serial number on the watch. If they don't, generally stay away from those watches.
So, to find the right era, look for serial numbers and make sure all the parts are original and from the proper time period.
Sometimes I'm confronted with what I would call fake watches or forged watches. And if you travel internationally, I think you will have plenty of chances to get watches like this offered, like here's a Rolex and for only $200. It's nearly impossible to determine whether this particular piece is really a real Rolex or just a plain fake.
How do you tell? In a Rolex, follow tip number 12 and look at the lugs. The lug is the protrusion of the case that attaches to the band or the bracelet. The numbers are under the watch band. You should look at the 6 o'clock.
At the 6 o'clock position between these two lugs, where the bracelet is covering right now, would be the actual serial number, which is the individual number for the case.
And at 12 o'clock,
You will always find the reference number at 12 o'clock.
both numbers, the serial number and reference number, correspond to a year the watch was made. If the numbers are missing, beware.
If the serial number on any watch, especially on a Rolex watch, has been removed, for me it's almost certain that the watch at some time has been stolen.
There are also clues for another popular brand, Patek Phlippe.
When buying a vintage important Patek Philippe, it's vital that the case number and the movement number actually match.
So to ensure you've got a genuine Patek Philippe watch, have an expert check the case back. It's tip 11.
If I look into the case back, inside I can spot certain numbers and markings engraved. They give me some good indication that the watch is for real, and on fake watches there will be fake numbers.
And Patek has all the numbers on record, so it's easy to verify your watch.
The only way for you to do that is to order an extract from the archives from Patek Philippe in Geneva, who will then issue a piece of paper which confirms that the watch was born at the time.
So make sure your Patek Philippe has matching numbers. We just learned the first 10 tips for collecting vintage wristwatches. Let's take another look. Tip number 20, join the NAWCC. Tip 19, get the whole package. 18, no paper, no problem. Get a loop. Wear it every day. Get a winder. Tip 14, keep it shut. 13, beware the Frankenwatch. 12, look at the lugs. Tip 11, check the case back. Coming up, what is the #1 thing that everyone looks for in vintage wristwatches? Find out when Collective Intelligence returns. Welcome back to Collective Intelligence, the top 20 tips on collecting vintage wristwatches. We've seen the first 10 tips, now let's get to the second half of our countdown.
After the quartz watch really came into being, there was a little bit of a downturn in the Swiss watchmaking industry. People did want to collect the older pieces as they saw it as possibly a dying art.
But there are new innovators in the watch field keeping the old artistry alive. And that brings us to tip number 10. Collect the innovators, like Richard Mille.
In the more modern watches, look at innovative new creators that have limited productions, such as Richard Mille, for example.
Watchmakers such as Richard Mille take the skills from the old masters and bring them into the modern world with a futuristic twist.
A lot of different watchmakers are very smart in reviving names of different makers, manufacturers, stepping up their production to now have a new outlet for people to collect the desirable mechanical wristwatch. We're seeing sort of a rebirth of the golden age, from the 1950s now, where, new makers are being able to come onto the field and are gaining vast recognition because of their design and their technology.
Now both trendsetters and jet setters will always be on time. You know you need to be careful with your watch. The question is, how careful?
If you imagine yourself as wearing an egg on your wrist when you're wearing a fine watch, you will obviously take very good care of that watch.
Tip number 9. Treat your watch like an egg.
Because these watches are old, they're delicate. The gears, the pivots are very fine in some cases, and that fineness translates to fragility. So if you expect to be in a situation where you're going to bang up the watch, like going to a gym, don't wear your vintage watch because you're going to damage it.
You wouldn't want to crack your egg. Try not to fry it either.
I'm always amused when I see, for example, people lying on the beach and getting a suntan and roasting their 5,000 or 10,000 or whatever value watch, because the extreme heat that after a while develops by exposure to sunlight will dry up the oils and the grease inside of the watch movement, and the watch at some time might not run precisely anymore.
Ah, hot fun in the sun. Just don't bake your watch. And another thing to look out for.
One important thing to remember is that watches that were made even in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, with the time, they're not as waterproof and watertight as they were then. So it is not advisable to take your 1960 vintage watch to go diving. Very often you'll just find that the water will just enter the entire watch, and that's basically the end of your watch.
Tip number 8 is a simple one. Watch the water.
If you go and swim into the ocean, the water can be very salty, and I would always suggest afterwards, let's say you wear a water-resistant Rolex watch, rinse it off with clear water so that the corrosive effect of salt cannot play any further role.
Rinse it, dry it, and keep an eye out for future damage.
If a watch shows moisture, and most of the time moisture might be a slight condensation that you see under the crystal or under the glass, I would say this particular watch is in a kind of state of emergency.
See little droplets in your case? Don't try to shake them out. You need to act fast. Tip number 7. Get to the watch doctor. Stat.
It probably means that the glass on top of your watch is not safely secured, so you need to bring it back to a service center for them to retighten that.
I had experienced this with one of my watches once. I opened the watch and carefully at a certain distance was pointing a hairdryer at the watch until I really could feel that the watch was very, very warm. So, and I must say it worked, because this way I dried up the moisture, and then the next day or 2 days afterwards I brought the watch to my watchmaker at the time and had it serviced.
It took a licking, but the watchmaker will get a ticking. Just take it in. All watches get a little smudged. You can clean the case, but be cautious, please. That's tip number 6. Use caution when you clean.
To clean a watch, one of the easiest ways is to just maybe take a cotton cloth or something soft and wipe the watch.
A chamois cloth can sometimes abrade the surface a little bit, so even if it's an old rag, whether you cut up some old really soft t-shirts or something, that's probably the best way just to do a surface cleaning on it.
Even with a soft cloth, remember to have a soft touch.
Don't rub too hard, because if there is any abrasions on your cloth, you're going to be scratching the side of the case.
Next step would be to use some cleaning solutions or cleaning agents, but here it's already becoming a little bit tricky, because if you have an older piece and it's not very, very water resistant, I wouldn't use any liquids at all.
So make sure to rub it the right way. A crystal is the protective covering of a watch dial. How serious is it if it cracks or breaks?
If the crystal or the glass that covers the dial on a watch, for example, is breaking, don't panic. It can be replaced.
Just be careful.
You have plexiglass splinters. Just be cautious that you don't hurt yourself and that you don't scratch the dial. And normally crystals can be relatively easily being replaced. However, a watchmaker has to find the right size that fits to that particular watch.
And that's tip number 5. One size does not fit all when it comes to watch glass.
It's absolutely something that you cannot do yourself. It has to be really fitted by a qualified person.
If the glass of your watch breaks, you need to bring it back to an authorized retailer for them to change it.
Take it to an experienced watchmaker. Don't do it yourself. As you wear your watch, it moves in different positions with your wrist. After all, it's attached to your arm. Each watch is tested for the positions before it ever gets to you.
Watches that are made to very, very high standards will be very, very cautiously regulated with great care, so that even among different positions, that the watch will always run at its best or at a very, very precise rate.
Wristwatches of better quality are generally tested in 5 positions, mimicking what a watch would go through in daily wear. Face on top, then face on the side, face down, then on a 4th position like this, and a 5th position slightly angled.
More positions mean better quality, so tip 4 is to look inside for markings.
A number of watches you will see actually hand engraved or stamped into the movement that it has been adjusted to a number of positions.
Some of the information that's given on these watches are the number of positions and adjustments.
3 is good, 5 is better, and 8 is great.
You certainly don't want to force the crown and wind it to the point where you're going to have it overwound and possibly damage the movement. So, usually, at least with my own watch, I will give it, a good sort of 4 or 5 turns, and then make sure that I do it, every morning going there forward.
You can wind it forwards or backwards or both. It's just a personal preference.
But just don't overdo it. Be kind when you wind. That's tip 3.
You can wind as long as you don't feel a slight resistance. Slight resistance would mean that the watch is fully wound, and if you continue winding and really force it, you might break something.
Setting the date on your watch is not as easy as you think.
To set the date on a mechanical watch, there are a few things that one should take into consideration. For example, the day has 24 hours and a watch dial typically has only 12 hours indicated. So this means that during the 24-hour day, the hands on the watch have to move twice around the dial and passing the number 12.
While an outside dial shows 12 hours, inside the complicated dials and mechanisms are operating on a 24-hour system.
A few precautions. Normally, the date changes around midnight, and there are certain gears and certain levers, there are certain wheels with teeth that are connected to the date mechanism, and all these different parts of the watch are starting to do their work, let's say, roughly around 9 p.m.
That's tip number 2. Don't change the date between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m.
As a general guideline, from 9 p.m. in the evening until 3 a.m. in the morning, For most watches, do not interfere with the date mechanism by pulling out the crown and trying to adjust the date.
But there are additional considerations with more complicated watches like a moon phase or a perpetual calendar.
In complicated pieces, normally the manufacturer's manual will always tell you at which times you should or at which times you should not change and interfere with the date or calendar mechanism.
Use midnight as your reference and don't go past it. Be a morning person and set the date early in the day. Before we spring ahead to tip 1, let's fall back and review tips 10 through 2. Tip number 10, collect new innovators like Richard Mille. Tip 9, treat your watch like an egg. 8, watch the water. Get to the watch doctor. Use caution when cleaning. One size does not fit all. Look for markings. Be kind when you wind. Don't change between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. And now for tip 1 on collecting vintage wristwatches.
A dial could represent 70–80% of the value of a vintage watch.
The dial or the face of the watch should be in good condition and not reprinted, in the sense that it should be the original dial that the watch was born with.
Talk about face value. Our number 1 tip is, it is all in the dial.
A lot of people will have these dials refinished or reprinted. And this idea can actually, with some very, whether it be a $5,000 watch, a $2,000 watch, or a $300,000 watch, it can lower that value by half or even more.
If you're buying a watch and the dial looks brand new or too white, it's probably a clear indication that the dial has been refreshed or reprinted. So I would advise to stay away from those watches.
Remember that tool you can't do without? Pick up that loop and take a look.
It's important to spend a lot of time doing your homework. Because there are so many nuances to every vintage watch, there are many shady dealers out there that will try to sell you what looks like a great watch, but that watch might have a refinished dial. And that's very common in vintage watches.
Spend your time wisely and enjoy your vintage watch. Oh, and by the way, what time is it?
It's time to go.
Do and you haven't had a chance to do yet. And I just blurted out, I want to build a wooden boat.